Good evening. If you haven't found your seat, I invite you to find a comfortable seat here in Carroll Auditorium. And for those joining us virtually, find a comfortable seat wherever you find yourself. Thank you for joining us. My name is Daniel Horan, and I'm professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology here at St. Mary's College, where I have the absolute privilege of serving as the director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality. I'm delighted to welcome you to this lecture. But before introducing our guests, we have a few remarks, and I want to take a moment to say a word about the center. Founded in 1984 by Dr. Keith Egan with the support of the Sisters of the Holy Cross, and here I must pause to acknowledge Dr. Keith Egan is with us, and so many Sisters of the Holy Cross are joining us in person and virtually. Can I please ask for a round of thanks? The Center for the Study of Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. As an academic center, it is a hub for scholarly and public engagement, which draws on intellectual resources in the Catholic and broader Christian tradition, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Before proceeding, we here at St. Mary's College wish to acknowledge that we are gathering on sacred land and to honor the native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi and the Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize our native siblings and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. This annual Madeleva lecture is named after the late Sister Madeleva Wolf, who was a poet, a scholar, an educator, a higher education administrator, and a Sister of the Holy Cross. When Sister Madeleva was president of St. Mary's College, she established the groundbreaking School of Sacred Theology program, which was the first Catholic graduate program in the United States to admit women to study for master's and doctoral degrees in theology. The school thrived from 1943 until 1970. This annual lecture honors distinguished women theologians and other scholars of religion, and we are delighted that you're here with us today. In partnership with Paulus Press, and we want to acknowledge editor Donna Crilly, who is here representing our partners at Paulus Press, the annual Madeleva lecture is published every year as a small book, which makes this lecture accessible to a much broader audience. And now it's my honor to introduce this year's Madeleva lecturer. Dr. Natalia Imperatori-Lee is professor and chair of religious studies at Manhattan College in the Bronx, New York, where she also coordinates the Catholic Studies program. She's the author of 2 books. Her latest is titled Women and the Church, From Devil's Gateway to Discipleship. If that title doesn't catch your attention. And, plug, it's for sale in the atrium from the St. Mary's College bookstore. Her other book from 2018, published by Orbis, is called Quentame, Narrative in Ecclesial Present. Her work has appeared in a number of academic journals, including Theological Studies and the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion. A Cuban-American native of Miami, Florida, Imperatori-Lee has served on the board of directors of the Catholic Theological Society of America and the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians in the United States. She holds degrees from multiple universities, including her undergraduate degree from Fordham University in New York, her master's degree from the University of Chicago, and her Doctor of Philosophy, her PhD in theology, from a university we've never heard of called Notre Dame. Natalia lives in the Bronx with her spouse, Michael E. Lee, a fellow theologian, and their 2 sons. And maybe the thing most distinguishing about her today is that she speaks not only to academic audiences, to broad public audiences as well, including as an interviewed guest on the Francis Effect podcast, which was released this morning. So look that up if you haven't seen it. Tonight, Professor Imperatori-Lee will deliver the 2024 Madeleva lecture titled Bearers of an Idle Tale, women's authority in a credibility economy. Please join me in extending a warm St. Mary's College welcome to Professor Imperatori-Lee.
Good. Thank you so much, Dan, and to Dr. Julia Feder, to everyone at the St. Mary's Center for Spirituality, to Maria and Rebecca, the student workers who are also doing so much work to make tonight possible. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to those who are watching on the live stream. I promised that I would shout out my feminist theology class at Manhattan College. So if you are watching, I know that you're watching, and I'm grateful. I love being back in South Bend. The weather is exactly as I remember it. I love being among so many friends, and I have to confess, as I've told many of you already, that it is a lifelong dream realized to stand here today ready to give this year's Madeleva lecture. Whew, I don't want to cry, so I won't. 31 years ago, in 1993, when I was a junior in high school, I pulled a small book from my sacraments teacher, Elsie Miranda, now a theologian herself, from her bookshelf, and I read my first bit of feminist theology. It was a Madeleva lecture. Sandra Schneider's Women and the Word, from 1986. Like any epiphany, it was a moment of radiance. It reoriented my life. It sparked ideas, the fruition of which I would only see decades later. The notion that our understanding of God is conditioned by our language, and that in examining and changing our language, we could come to grasp that God was beyond all of our human understanding, even of gender, was kind of a lot for a 16-year-old to wrap her mind around. But it was nothing short of life-changing, and it set me on a path that led me here. And so my overwhelming emotion today is gratitude. Let me preface tonight's remarks, and forgive me, I'm just going to talk a lot about myself because I'm an academic and this is what we do. I want to frame my remarks in terms of the origins of my thoughts on credibility, experience, and theology. While I have written in Cuéntame, as Dan so nicely mentioned, on the importance of narrative as a methodological building block for contemporary ecclesiology, the more I reflect, and really the more I live, the more I realize that the telling of stories is not enough. And so here are 3 experiences that ground my interest in women's stories and credibility as a category, and 3 questions that I hope will guide our time together. So experience number 1, my first class in feminist theology. I was at Fordham in the fall of 1995 with Elizabeth Johnson, who had previously taught 3rd grade, and therefore laid out very systematically and quite thoroughly all of the work that women had done in theology to get us to where we were that day. In reading the Bible against the grain with Phyllis Tribble and Sandra Schneider's and many others. In asking questions about the sexism inherent in Catholic theology with Mary Daly and Rosemary Radford Ruther and many others. And in reconstructing the Christian message about God, about the church, and about Christ with her own work. What an eye-opening semester that was. I moved through a thought cycle that's probably only possible for a sophomore in college. I loved it. I accepted it. I embraced this new way of doing theology, and I moved on with it firmly in my theological toolbox. I thought, this is great. I'm super glad that we have discovered this, and now we can do theology like this from now on. By the time I was in a PhD program in a far more clergy-heavy setting, I realized that women's voices, women's thought, and wisdom as a sort of essential, unchallenged part and parcel of any theological endeavor was far from a given. Fast forward 20 years to this semester, when I myself am teaching feminist theology, or even if I'm speaking about it to a group in a church, it continues to be breaking news to so many Catholics. As Dan mentioned, Sister Madeleva Wolf established her school in sacred theology in 1943. That is before my parents were born. Catholic women with PhDs in theology have been around more than 50 years, and women have been thinking about God since there were women. And yet here I am, like Sisyphus, rolling the same boulder up the same hill every semester at every lecture. Audiences remain astonished to hear that women interpret Scripture, that women write theology, that women reflect on God's activity in their lives. Why? One theory is that it is intentional, as in the patriarchy, the social order that is geared to the advantage of heterosexual white men, deliberately obscures women's thought, in this case, their theological thought, so that each subsequent generation of thinkers is forced to retread the same ground. The goal here is to make women waste their time, get frustrated, and give up. Or at the very least, to slow the process of breaking new ground because we're constantly having to re-break the same ground. Is the Sisyphean task of introducing feminist theology again and again and again the result of a deliberate conspiracy on the part of the patriarchy? I don't think so. I think that attributes a level of deviousness and, quite frankly, a practical ability to carry out devious plans that I don't associate with most people, especially not with collectives. I just don't think people are that good at this. But then why don't students know about feminist theology? Why don't church groups know? The hunger has stayed the same. The epiphanies are still happening. But we are way past the point where these insights should be epiphanies. We should be 2 to 3 generations into women's theological production being common knowledge in Catholic circles, but it's not. So the first experience, which I'll call the Sisyphus experience, prompts this question. Is there something about women doing theology that is inherently incredible or unbelievable? So that's one. Let's move to experience 2. The testimony of Christine Blasey Ford in the Supreme Court confirmation hearings for Brett Kavanaugh. A lot of times in class, students are horrified to learn about the relatively ubiquitous idea in ancient religions that women couldn't testify in court because their word was worthless. They needed a man to prove that they were telling the truth and were treated almost like children, not as reliable witnesses. To my students, it seems preposterous and anachronistic, right? Oh, those poor dumb people back then. Until you watch Ford's testimony, which was impeccable. It was perfect. It contained no inconsistencies. We watched a blonde, white, well-educated woman telling what happened to her in as much detail and with as much recall as she could. It was convincing, even to people who were inclined to not believe her. It was moving. It reminded many of us of experiences in our own lives. And yet, in the end, it came to nothing. She had to leave her home amid death threats. He got a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land. Her gut-wrenching testimony amounted to an idle tale, signifying nothing. Collectively, publicly, women were reminded that it didn't matter how much or how clearly they remembered. It didn't matter how brave they were in coming forward or how perfect they were as victims or survivors or as witnesses. Might made right, yet again. I remember watching it on the 4th floor of my office is on the 4th floor of a building where all of the humanities professors are, and all of the women professors were watching it on their computers. You could walk through the hall and hear the testimony in stereo. And it was a huge blow, right? Another eye-opening experience, and it prompted this question. Even today, in 2024, are women reliable narrators of their own experiences? Or has the justice system remained fundamentally unchanged? I've seen some signs up around the college that say "Believe survivors" in the Ted Lasso font. It's really good. Why is "Believe women" a controversial slogan even now? Okay, here comes the third one. It's funnier, I promise. The third animating experience happened after we moved to New York. This is our 20th year in New York City. I was finishing my PhD. I think I left after my 4th year, so it was my 5th year. And I was invited to be on a radio show with a priest for a Catholic radio network. All of these players will remain nameless. Part of the process was to do a couple of audition tapings in a studio where I was the prospective co-host. At the time, I had finished my comprehensive exams, and I did all right. And I was ABD. I was very much in the throes of writing a dissertation on ecclesiology, and if any of you are grad students or have spoken to a graduate student, you know that when someone is in the throes of writing their dissertation, it really is the only thing that they can talk about. And so the format of the radio show included call-in questions. And sometimes, during the answering part, I would answer, because I knew the answer. Why does the church believe X? And I would say, well, this doctrine developed because of A, B, C in the context of X, Y, Z. And after a couple of these auditions in Manhattan, the executive in charge of communications for the Archdiocese pulled me aside to give me a few notes. This was the note. You know, listeners don't want to hear you explaining church doctrine. They want to hear that from Father. But I naively thought, I'm the one who's about to get this PhD. I have 10 years of theological study under my belt, and he's got like 3 to 5. But it didn't matter, did it? Because whoever the listeners were, and I suspect it was the people in charge at the Archdiocese, didn't want to hear me talking about doctrine. They wanted it to come from Father. So that's my final question. Why is Father, whoever he is, and many of you are here, and that's fine. Seriously, I'm totally good. Why is Father believable as a source of doctrinal knowledge or explanatory narrative, but not doctor or professor or young upstart ABD person with a lot of theological training? Right? These 3 experiences coalesce around the notion of credibility. How do we decide who we believe? And is it an individual conscious decision, or are there structural factors at work in making some people more credible than others? Philosophers like Miranda Fricker, Jose Medina, and others argue that we're part of a credibility economy. And this is in the title, right? A web of reciprocal relationships wherein there's an imbalance of power related to believability. A person's believability varies depending on their social role, but also depending on personal characteristics. Marginalized persons generally suffer from a credibility deficit, and persons from dominant social, economic, racial, and ethnic groups tend to enjoy a credibility excess in this economy. Throughout tonight's remarks, I'm indebted to the work of theologian Erin Kidd of St. John's University, particularly her engagement with Fricker's thought. Fricker is a feminist philosopher who coined the term epistemic injustice, and Jess, I think you work on this as well. Epistemic injustice is a very dense philosophical term. I'm always afraid of philosophers because they're very, very careful with language, and I am not. But it's made up of many parts, and I will attempt to unpack them here. Overall, Fricker and Kidd utilize epistemic injustice to highlight the intellectual imbalance associated with knowledge production and believability. So let's delve into it. First, there are 2 kinds of epistemic injustice: distributive and discriminatory. Distributive is easy to understand, right? Distributive epistemic injustice refers to the distribution of or access to goods pertaining to knowledge. So education, information, internet access, books in a language that you read, things like that. Not all of us have equitable access to education and the rest of those things. Therefore, injustice is present. If you're poor, if you're from a marginalized community, you have a harder time gaining access to quality education. So on one level, we don't all equally know because we don't all have equal access to how we get knowledge. That's the one. The second kind of epistemic injustice is discriminatory. If distributive is about access to knowledge goods, then discriminatory is more about increasing and decreasing credibility based on prejudice. That prejudice can be individual or structural. And this is where I think epistemic injustice intersects with feminist theology in important ways for me. Individual discriminatory epistemic injustice, which is a mouthful. We're just going to call testimonial injustice, where the structural variety we might just call hermeneutic injustice. While Fricker's definitions of these are a little bit more sort of detailed and complex, that's the sort of shorthand that I'll use for tonight. What makes a person credible? Credibility attaches to a person either because of their role or because of personal characteristics. And similarly, role and personal characteristics can cause credibility to decrease. Individually, a hearer can be prejudiced. So if Magda says something, but there is a quality about her that I find somewhat distasteful or untrustworthy, it causes me not to put my trust in her word, right? I give her less credibility. If I'm prejudiced against non-white persons, then I'm inclined not to believe them. I perceive them as less credible. If, and this is a dangerous thing to say here in the Irish land, if I believe that like red-haired people have no soul, for example, and are more likely to lie, then if they report a crime, I'm more suspicious. I don't trust their word. That's testimonial injustice, kind of individually on the part of the hearer. Women, as we all know, suffer from testimonial injustice regularly and have historically, as we saw in the case of Dr. Ford, and many survivors of sexual violence before and since. Our society's stereotypes about women as flighty or emotional have rendered women's word less trustworthy, and women as a class less believable, because we associate emotion with volatility and accuracy with unwavering intellectual rigor. Kidd points out in her work that we also see testimonial injustice in the case of clerical sex abuse survivors, but in a bit of a different key, since many of those survivors who came forward initially were men. That testimonial injustice did not happen because of the prejudice against the person testifying, initially mostly men, many of whom were white. Instead, the injustice stemmed from a level of role incredulity. Objections sort of took the form of claiming that the abuse simply could not have happened because the victim was talking about a priest. And there was no way that a priest could do all of these terrible things that they were talking about. Those ideas all stem from testimonial injustice. So testimonial injustice can go both ways. It can create a credibility deficit, someone we don't trust because of who they are, or a credibility excess, someone we are inclined to believe because of who they are. For years and years, clergy enjoyed an excess of credibility because Catholics associated the priesthood with a special kind of holiness. The clerical state of life was believed to be higher than the lay state, and therefore clergy were higher up on the holiness ladder. Perhaps that was why radio listeners didn't want to hear a layperson talk about church doctrine, because the clergy has or had a credibility excess. A second example of this credibility variance can be seen in student course evaluations, and those of you who are teaching know exactly what I'm talking about. Because we are taught to expect our experts to look a certain way, and when they don't, we can't make sense of it. This leads to a slew of problems inherent in student evaluations of courses, and if you are an undergrad, pay special attention because you're getting ready to fill these out. American students reliably rate white male heterosexual professors without an accent higher across the board in course evaluations than professors who deviate from those qualities. Male professors are 2 to 3 times more likely to be described as brilliant or genius by their students, whereas women are more likely to be described according to affective terms like nice or not nice, or much worse than that. I kept it PG. Women who conform to gender roles like nurturing, kindness, gentleness, smiling score higher, but still overall lower than the men do, given that women's prescribed gender role is about being nice and men's is about being smart. Women professors, and this is exacerbated intersectionally with the compounding prejudices of race, gender, sexual orientation, language proficiency, cannot attain the level of brilliance of their male counterparts because students, and really all of us, are trained not to believe that experts look like women. Again, this credibility deficit coincides with the phenomenon of role incredulity. Experts aren't supposed to look like Black women, so students tend to disbelieve Black women professors. Women as a group have long suffered a credibility deficit, and this is exacerbated by other bits of marginalization: race, gender identity, sexual orientation, wealth. We've seen how intersectionality and the identities therein affect credibility in our country's long history with racism, for example. Intersectional analysis of the credibility economy leads to some surprising inversions. The case of Emmett Till is only one instance where a white woman's credibility deficit for being a woman was nevertheless enough to override the credibility deficit of a young black man in the South. He paid with his life for that particular instance of testimonial injustice. But testimonial injustice harms us all. It predisposes us to disbelieve people who are historically disempowered or marginalized, and it enables us to believe the powerful because we associate them with virtue in some way. Bless you. Credibility deficits don't just happen on an individual level, though. If it were only an individual problem, then we could simply root out the prejudiced individuals, and the problem would be fixed. But like all of our prejudices, there's a structural component to epistemic injustice. Fricker calls this communal or structural component hermeneutical injustice, which means it's a type of injustice that has to do with meaning-making or interpretation. I like to think of it as shut out of the storytelling injustice. Hermeneutical injustice happens when a marginalized group is excluded from the social process of meaning-making, and therefore lack the words, the concepts, the interpretive tools to explain their experiences to others, or even to understand these experiences themselves. Fricker terms this a gap in collective understanding that exists because of the relative powerlessness or isolation of the people experiencing that situation. So like, the best example that literally just came to me in the hotel when I was going over this was the Me Too movement, right? All of these people had been having these experiences, and it wasn't until Me Too, Me Too, Me Too, Me Too sort of took over, after Tarana Burke coined it, took over the Twitter, to make visible the ubiquity of sexual harassment in women's lives. I have two other examples of it as well. Domestic violence. Domestic violence and or marital rape was inconceivable, in that it was inconceivable that it would constitute a crime. When men were charged with making and interpreting laws, and women weren't viewed as human beings, but as possessions, you cannot imagine that something like intimate partner violence would be criminal activity. The criminalization of domestic violence took a long time and was helped along very much not just by women's activism, though that was important, but by the invention of the Polaroid camera, which allowed women to retain evidence of bruises and other signs of violence to kind of keep in the back of their closets for when they were ready to come forward with their stories. They had physical evidence to show. Intimate partner violence remains ubiquitous but underreported. Advocacy organizations estimate that 35% of women and 25% of men experience some sort of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. The number is higher for college students. Indiana ranks 6th, I think, in the nation of states with intimate partner violence prosecutions. The prevalence of sexual assault on college campuses, as we know, is staggering. And the dearth of prosecutions for these crimes is equally astonishing. Only since the advent of consciousness-raising groups in second-wave feminism and subsequent have women been able to come together and recognize those, oh yeah, right? Judith Plaskow calls them those yeah moments that she had at Yale, right? Sitting around and being like, yeah, that guy did that to me too. Yeah, that professor ignores me too. Yeah. And those moments made their marriages, their work lives, their college experiences intelligible to them for the first time. Right? That is sort of the undoing of hermeneutical injustice. More frighteningly, women's exclusion from social meaning-making affected our understanding of the institution of marriage. Historically, and even sacramentally to some extent, marriage was understood as a contract providing a safe haven for male lust, like a garage, as a place where men could satisfy their sexual urges. This meant that the concept of unwanted sexual contact, which we have a word for, it's rape, within a marriage was inconceivable. It was the woman's obligation to provide her husband with sex. It was even colloquially known as the marital debt. If it's framed as a debt, then refusing to pay is the crime, not collecting the debt. Marital rape was not criminalized in all 50 states until 1993, the year I read Schneider's Madeleva lecture. Marital rape was rarely considered possible before the 1970s. It is a hermeneutical injustice because the way women were taught to talk about marriage and to think about marriage included this blanket willingness to engage in sex. There was not room in the story for being coerced or worse. Consent was not part of the discussion because it was assumed in the I do of the story. That story, we now know, was too narrow because the story was created without women's input. Even women couldn't conceptualize marital rape because the paradigm of marriage relegated them to objects for men's fulfillment. And if that phrase sounds familiar, we read the same theologians. A religious example of hermeneutical injustice, of the unimaginability of a ubiquitous experience, is available to us in the work of Judith Plaskow, one of my predecessors at Manhattan College. She's a Jewish feminist theologian. She writes that halakhic codes, such as Deuteronomy 22:28, dictated that the punishment for a man raping a virgin was financial restitution to the woman's father and also the rapist agreeing to marry her. Plaskow asks how it is possible that the punishment for rape be that a woman gets to marry her rapist. And the answer, of course, is that the law was elaborated entirely from the perspective of men. Only someone who is treating women as possession and not as a human being would view that as a just punishment for the rapist and not a complete trauma for the survivor. The only way that story is plausible is if women are not people, but property. The story of what marriage was, what sex was, what women were, was too narrow. By excluding women from the community of meaning-making and sense-making, lawmakers, ancient and modern, blinded themselves to the reality of women's bodily integrity and dignity. Given the wide-ranging, let me take a sip of water, but given the wide-ranging nature and diverse components of epistemic injustice that we've outlined, I need water for this one. Distributive, discriminatory, testimonial, and hermeneutic, we must ask where are the points of intersection and creative friction between this philosophical understanding and women's theological production. For Dr. Kidd, epistemic injustice is a key category in how we minister to survivors of sexual assault, both in the church and outside of it. Consistent exposure to hermeneutical and testimonial injustice, says Kidd, does theological harm because it prevents a victim's spiritual formation and therefore inhibits or truncates her relationship with God. We should therefore retrain our testimonial sensibility and view survivor testimonies as Dr. Kidd says, dangerous memories that help reframe our thinking and our theological imaginations. My interests move beyond the individual harm to Catholics who suffer from a credibility deficit or who are subjected to testimonial injustice, and toward the communal or ecclesial harm done by this injustice. Toward the end of her piece in Theological Studies, which I strongly recommend that you read, Dr. Kidd suggests that, quote, who does theology and whose theology is listened to matters. So we should look at the demographics of who historically has done theology, who is ordained, whose theology is read in seminaries, who is allowed to preach, et cetera, end quote, to get a sense of where our epistemic justice is rooted, or epistemic injustice is rooted. Not only does this injustice harm an individual in her quest for spiritual development, to be known and understood and understand herself as loved by God, but epistemic injustice also harms the church as a communal entity and prevents it from being a sacrament of salvation by blinding the church to the complexities of human dignity, to the gifts of those who lack a credibility excess, and to the authority of those who suffer from role incredulity. Plaskow makes a radical claim in Standing Again at Sinai, arguing that since the Torah records the impressions and revelations of God's own self to men, There cannot truly be Judaism without the Torah that was revealed and is revealed to women. And women must still create this. Similarly, I'd like to argue that the church is hopelessly handicapped, less than what it needs to be, as long as it continues to ignore theology done by women, as long as women suffer from the epistemic injustice perpetrated by clericalism and by deficient dogmatic understandings of women's nature. As long as women are shut out of the conversations, out of seminaries, and out of ordained ministry, the church fails to witness to the fullness of the reality of God. How? 3 ways. I was trained by Jesuits. Matt's laughing. First, the gender story told by the church. Complementarianism. It's okay, I want to throw things too. Complementarianism exemplifies hermeneutical injustice. Claiming exemption from gender theory, whatever that is, the Vatican has nevertheless time and again asserted that men and women are different but complementary. Complementarity is a theoretical system of gender that is binary in its nature and ultimately relies on an essentialist biology is destiny kind of reasoning. Women have uteruses and therefore are meant to make space for the other. Men are, in an Aristotelian Thomistic mashup for the ages, the active principle in sex, and therefore are the principal actors in public life, in decision-making, and in their families. Women are nurturing and emotional, men are pragmatic and intellectual. This binary notion of gender is increasingly outdated and unscientific, but the church continues to double down on it, even this week. John Paul II, Pope St. John Paul II, asserted in Mulieris Dignitatem that women possess a universal vocation to maternity, whether physical or spiritual. Of course, we know that many women cannot be mothers, and many more will not be mothers, physically or spiritually, because that is simply not their life's path. But the story of women as mother is so powerful that despite the many persons who proclaim themselves exceptions to this gender story, and the many ways that the church implicitly acknowledges the inadequacy of this stance on women and motherhood, such as acknowledging that infertility is not a sin, or marrying people who are past childbearing age, as a church, we cannot seem to break out of this theological language. And so we find even Pope Francis's dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, despite its progressive stances on so many issues, rendered incapable of talking about women as anything but enhancements, albeit important enhancements, whatever that means, to the church's project. Francis famously called women theologians the strawberries on the theological cake. Remember that one? That was a great one. Oh. More recently, he said that women bring beauty and care to the world. Always softness, always aesthetics, always a gentleness that is a complement to men's harsh, unwavering, uncaring rationality. Excluding women from meaning-making results in an image of women always in relation, never self-determined, but rather over-determined by the male other, as mother, as wife, as bride, as nurturer, as adornment. Structurally enforced hermeneutical injustice prevents women from naming the revelation they have received. And when they do, it is classified as mysticism, or reflection, or beauty. I have to take a little aside here. The worst instance of sexism that was, the worst sexism I got, someone did a sexism to me. And the worst one, it was done by a woman academic, and I will never say her name. But I was giving, it was part of a panel to talk about maybe the beginning of Francis's pontificate. And everyone was giving, big boy lectures on Francis's pontificate. Edward Hannenberg will talk about, Francis's ecclesiology, and so will talk about Francis's theology of God. And Natalia Imperatori-Lee, a woman and mother, will reflect on Francis's. And I was like, why do I get to reflect, but they get to think? Anyway, we all have a part to play in the patriarchy. We don't just reflect, right? We're allowed to think. Reflecting even is an in-relation sort of thing, right? Mirrors reflect. They don't create. Anyway. The magisterium lacks a category for women's theological rigor because their gender theory excludes women epistemologically as knowers. Women as anything but persons in relation becomes a category that, as Jose Medina notes, suffers from the sin of unimaginability. Beyond ignorance, the incapacity to conceive of something. Unimaginability, this is the second one. Unimaginability exists too in our church's pervasive commitment to the maleness of God. Why am I still talking about this nearly 40 years after Sandra Schneider stood here? And even more since Mary Daly noted the correlation between God's imagined gender and the social hierarchy we see on earth. Ecclesially, this magisterium's continued commitment to the so-called Marian and Petrine principles in the church hobbles the people of God by shoehorning the church into a binary that is both non-biblical and nonsensical. Despite women's protests, despite the ease with which these binary principles crumble when, for example, theologians are forced to make the case that laymen are part of the Marian principle, but women cannot for any reason participate in the Petrine one, the Vatican remains steadfast in its dedication to this Balthasarian imagery. The binary proves to be quite fragile under scrutiny, and yet it enjoys prominence in official church documents. Might this be because of the credibility excess of thinkers like Balthasar among the clerical class? All talk of respecting women and their vocations, of valuing women as decision makers and givers of input, remains a marginal possibility at best, as long as these categories remain in vogue. My last point, number 3, is about women's credibility deficit and the credibility deficit of all non-clergy in our hierarchical church. Much has been made in the pontificate of Francis of becoming what he calls a listening church. We can look to the ongoing synod as a prime example of an attempt at becoming such a church that listens to those on the margins, a church that listens to the poor and disenfranchised, a church that sits in round tables. That was so exciting. Remember how excited we were when we saw the round tables? I admit I was excited then. I was. It was really cool. Anyway, as promising as all this sounds, it cannot help but fall short, and I have to confess that I'm doubtful. I mean, help my unbelief. But I am doubtful that the synod's various sessions will come to any significant change. Time and again, women have been forced to learn the harsh reality that listening is not enough. In some of my previous work, I've noted that it is not sufficient to, quote, add Latinos and stir to our theologies in order for them to be inclusive. For theology to include the voices of marginalized racial and ethnic communities, these communities must be allowed to drive and set priorities, to be presented, as I've noted, in the beginnings of courses, and not in the end, after all the real theology has been done, as some enhancement. I'm afraid that the concept of a listening church suffers a bit from this and stir optimism that is ultimately insufficient. Because as a church, we have to go beyond listening to women. We have to believe them. Believe them to be narrators of their own experience. Believe them to be dialogue partners with God. Believe them to be capable theologians and scripture scholars and interpreters of God's activity in their lives and in the wider world. Listening alone is just not enough. We all listened to Christine Blasey Ford. We listened to Anita Hill. We listen when we're presented with a theological perspective from Hildegard of Bingen or Teresa of Avila. You're listening to me right now. But do you believe me? Are we not, as feminist theologians, consistently reminded that persons in this role simply do not look like we do? That role incredulity is kind of part and parcel of this vocation? And yet, I don't want to bum you out, so we're going to take it up a bit. There are seeds in the gospel that point toward a remedy for the widespread epistemic, testimonial, and hermeneutic injustice women suffer in our church's credibility economy. I want to finish this evening with a foundational gospel story that speaks to me about credibility deficits and how the church has used this concept, even without naming it as such, from its very beginnings. It's from Luke's account of the resurrection, and it's also the tip-off for the title of this talk. As we know, women appearing as key figures among the earliest Christians is widely recognized as a scandalous admission, and women appearing by name in the Gospels is very rare indeed. But in all 4 evangelist accounts, Mary Magdalene is among the first to see the risen Christ. And here's how Luke tells it. And returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them, who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale. And they, the 11, did not believe them, the women. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in. He saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home amazed at what had happened. The 11 listened to Mary Magdalene, but they didn't believe her. Peter didn't really believe her. He had to run and go see for himself. But the gospel writers include Mary Magdalene's testimony in the stories of the resurrection, even though it was embarrassing to them to have the central claim of Christianity rely on the previously worthless testimony of a woman, as New Testament scholar and my colleague Claudia Setzer has noted. After all, the earliest Christians were fighting claims of being too egalitarian and too effeminate in their religiosity. So having a woman be the testimonial linchpin to the resurrection is scandalous. But as I learned from my feminist theologian professors and my Madeleva predecessors, this is testament to the truth of Magdalene's witness, that the community is willing to risk embarrassment, shame, and scandal to tell the truth about the resurrection. It would have been easier to leave it out. The 11 men caricature Mary Magdalene and the other women as bearers of an idle tale. They suffered from a credibility deficit and also from a hermeneutical impossibility, right? The unimaginability of something like a resurrection. People didn't just rise from the dead. So they listened, but they did not believe. On the other hand, the church we inherit from the apostles does believe Mary Magdalene's testimony. The church exists as a witness to our belief in her story. So the question for us tonight is, can we get back there again? Can we look at Mary Magdalene and see neither a prostitute or a teller of idle tales, but instead see a woman who bears the good news, an apostle to the apostles? And if we can see apostolicity, preaching, prophetic ecclesial awareness in Mary Magdalene, what will it take so we can see it, hear it, and believe it in women today? Thank you.
So we have some time now for questions and comments from our audience. We have 2 microphones on either end of the auditorium, so please raise your hand and we'll find you.
This is the fun part.
So you asked, what would it take for people to believe us as women? Mm-hmm. Do you have an answer to that question?
Yes, I do. I have several. Let women preach in Mass. That's, I think, the easiest one. I think part of the unimaginability of it is that most Catholics get their theology from homiletics. Very few Catholics are fortunate enough to be at a Catholic institution for any part of their education, but many Catholics go to church. And so they are limited to whatever the priest is preaching about and whatever his education gave him. And, I'm not priests have a lot to do, and there are very few of them. So it's not like they're doing professional development, reading Beth Johnson's latest book. That's not happening. it's not even happening because they don't have the time, right? Regardless of inclination. So why not let other voices come into the sanctuary and provide theological reflection? I think the lack of imaginability is just that we haven't seen it, right? It's just, all it takes is 1, 2, 3 weeks, and then it won't seem that weird anymore. So that's one, right? And then, make the seminaries co-ed. Big believer in the value of everyone who's going to be a cleric. If we're going to keep an all-male clergy, which, whatever, but if that's what we're going to do, then they should all have to be in class with women, and everyone should get beaten by a girl at some point in their life in a theology class. Because it's good for you. It's good for all of us. It's good for, the competition of the graduate school classroom is good for that. And if you're only in class, this was my fear with sending my son to an all-boys school. If you're only ever in class with people who look like you, then you're not sure that the other people can think too. So yeah, that would be my 2 first ideas. Thanks.
Imperatori-Lee.
Hi, Larissa.
Thank you so much. My question also is going to be very practical, even though I have a billion other more, smart intellectual questions for you. What would you say to your students, your feminist theology class watching right now, this lovely group of women theologians who came to root for you in this section right here, and other women who have unfortunately internalized the credibility deficit. And so I'll just give an example from my own life. When I was a TA for a course, I was giving a lecture, and I had a student interrupt the lecture. No, I'm serious. Interrupted me and said, "Everything you're saying is contradictory to everything we've learned up to this point in the class, and I don't believe anything you're saying." And I'm like, oh. I have 12 years of training and you're 18 years old. What do you know about, But I actually took this person's words to heart, and I was like, maybe I am stupid. maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. And so when we experience racism, microaggressions, sexism, we tend to internalize the structural credibility deficits in our environment. So my question is very practical. How do we begin to challenge the bias in ourselves, where we're limiting our own potential because of the deficit that's out there that has now been ingrained into us? So that's my question.
That's a really hard question and very smart. I think, 2 things. Number one, to acknowledge that you're not crazy, right, is a really important thing. This is where those consciousness-raising groups are really important, right? And this is my second point. Community is what community of people who are going through the same thing. I think all of us, regardless of our gender or our sex or our sexual orientation, only ever remember the bad things that people have said on our course evaluations, right? I mean, I can get 60, she's the best person in the whole wide world, and 1, she's really disorganized, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm really disorganized. They're right. So I think that having a community where you can sort of share these experiences, because you're not the only one that's going through them, is very sort of practically useful, because it counterbalances the voice of, I am singularly stupid in this academy. I am singularly the imposter. I am singularly the one that someone's going to eventually find out doesn't belong here. That's a shared, and even before we had the term imposter syndrome, remember before that? And we all thought we were just fooling everybody, and then it turns out it was a syndrome, and we're like, oh, thank God. Wait, everyone else thought they were fooling everyone too. And there was such a sort of, it really brought the anxiety down. And now it turns out that the only people who don't have imposter syndrome should have imposter syndrome. But that sort of having a community around you where you can be real and they can be real with you and be like, I said this, is this really off the wall? And your real friends will tell you, that's kind of pushing it. But they will also lift you up and say, no, you're coming from a very real place. And that helps, I think, counteract the narrative that we create and exacerbate, especially in our own minds, about our own inadequacy. Because it's true, you can believe it. Half the time, I don't believe that I belong. I certainly don't believe that I belong here. Believe that you belong in these places of authority. And I think that that's probably, there's a little bit of that that's good, right? But too much of it handicaps you, and that's a real problem. So yeah, make good friends.
Thank you so much, Natalia, for coming and offering an honest and hard and wonderful Madeleva talk. I am so grateful.
Thank you.
You just mentioned authority, which is a term that I hear more often in thinking about doing God talk. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between credibility and authority? I'm a little worried we've lowered the bar.
Yeah. I think you're really onto something there, and it's very worrisome, right? Who has authority, and how we conflate authority and power, right? Authority, the way I learned it, I feel like as an undergraduate, is that authority that's something that comes from being genuine, right? So Martin Luther King Jr. had authority, even though in the society he was in, he had very little power. But he ended up with power because he had authority, right? I don't know that that is necessarily the way that we use authority in church circles, right? I think that we use it as a substitute for power. And that's problematic because there are authoritative voices that are permanently excluded from the power structure. And so how do you break into that, or break that divide, right? I know that there are people in the audience who know a lot about speaking with authority, so I'm going to be very careful here. But but I think that this is a massive issue. And so the role and credulity of women in any sort of position of ecclesial authority is very problematic. You can see that in the pushback that Francis has gotten, even in naming women to secondary roles in dicasteries, right? People are freaking out about that because of the inhospitability of those spaces for women. And again, it's not even feminists necessarily. It's just anyone who is shaped like a woman in that space is seen as sort of undermining the authority of the chair of Peter or something. And I think that one of the things I hope to kind of look a little bit more into is what are the remedies for this, right? Medina talks about epistemic friction. I think Fricker talks about virtuous listening. There have to be some sort of strategies that we can do. Although I hate listening, I genuinely think that listening is something that can be ignored after you did it, right? Because we've seen it happen a bunch of times, right? You listen, and then go back and do the same thing again. So I don't know that virtuous listening is going to be my way, but epistemic friction, kind of bringing people together who have very different epistemic horizons and seeing what is generated there might be a remedy. But I think authority is something that's really a crisis in the church right now. I see it in my students who ascribe zero authority. They're post-Catholic. They're not at Notre Dame. They're not at St. Mary's. They don't have that sort of prior commitment to religiosity. So for them, the church has no authority, and you sort of have to make a case for it. And that's very hard to do, So yeah, I think that you're hitting on kind of the salient point, as ever, Molly.
I love this notion of the call to the listening that leads to conversion.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Such a wonderful talk.
Thanks.
As someone who considers herself a feminist theologian and has really fallen in love with the practice here at St. Mary's, and as someone who's looking to earn a law degree in the next few years, I have a lot of interest in the testimonial injustice that you were talking about, and Ford's testimony, that these are really real practical issues of injustice and sexism that we face every day, that I see often at the office. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, when we think about these things, that there's obviously a lack in the church that you're calling to, but there's a lack in our world. Do you see us acting as kind of a corporate communion of believers as a potent enough catalyst to kind of change some of this sexism in the world? Or do you think it's going to take more than that? I like to think of the verse in Hebrews about, so now you're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, that witness is important here. So how do you see the church becoming that witness to the secular world as well, and the onus not falling on the women who need the credibility yet still?
Weirdly, I think that secular spaces might be the ones that are called to convert the church and not so like an epistemic openness to the secular as not the sort of secularization boogeyman of the antithesis of all the things that are religious or sacred, but rather as a conversation partner that can point out some of the blindness in our ecclesial community. Because I do think, like, when I think of that great cloud of witnesses, which is one of my favorite images of the church, Johnson talks about it as like people in heaven cheering for us here on earth, which is one of the most beautiful things I can think of, like nameless people, your family who have passed away, all these people are cheering you on, right? That great cloud. I don't think that that great cloud is only made up of people who went to church. Is that weird to say here at Notre Dame? I think that there's a conversion that we are called to as a community of believers, which is such a weird thing to say when we're talking about testimonial injustice. Are we a community of believers, or are we like half listeners? And then like kind of go on to your stuff. But as a community of ostensibly a community of believers, there's something that we can take from the strides that women have made in the secular world, which again is not perfect, but nevertheless, I mean, I think a little bit better than what we're doing in the church. And it's not either or, right? I think that there's a mutuality there. There's a dialogue that is possible, but I don't know that, especially on the sexism front, it's going to be us converting them. It's going to come the other way. But thank you. And thank you for identifying as a feminist theologian. You warm my dead little heart.
Hi, I just wanted to say...
Where are you? Oh, there you are. Okay.
I just wanted to say I really appreciate this talk. Just as a student who has been learning about this theology the last 4 years, I really thought about the little you as a sophomore that you said. That was me as a freshman. This was very much, and then, the world gets a little more complicated. But just a question for you. So you talked about the ways that these injustices handicap us. So how do they handicap us?
They blind us, right? It's a blinding. You can't imagine, right? So the first time you have a Black woman professor, right? You couldn't imagine that it was possible. And so the kind of hurdle that professor has to clear is so much higher. And why should she have to work that hard, right? The idea that I have something to learn from someone who I think is marginal, right? Someone who doesn't have, 12 years of theological training, right? I don't want to sound like a snob about that, even though I am a little bit of a snob about that. But it's not only about that, right? It's about openness and not being sort of closed off. And I think that hermeneutic injustice blinds us to things that are happening within ourselves because it doesn't allow us to reflect appropriately on our own experience. But testimonial injustice blinds us to the grace that lives in the other, right? And to the revelation that they can be for us. And that is, you're missing out, right? And if you start ignoring people as a class, whether on the basis of whatever prejudice, right, then you are missing out on more and more and more of the mosaic of God's grace that you don't see or can't see. It's not even don't, but it's an impossibility. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I'm not a theologian.
Oh, good.
I'm a poet. And one of the things that Sister Madeleva championed was beauty. And you have given us a mosaic of beauty in this new, I'm not going to say new because it's not that new, but in the way you frame your theological thought. It has such clarity and directness, which I deeply appreciate.
Thank you.
But what I'd like to hear more about, you mentioned 2 or 3 times beauty is one of the things that gets attached to women. And beauty is also a form of harmony. Benedict always wanted his monasteries to be full of beauty, beauty that's made by the members of that community. So where do you see us as women in our ability to carry that which the Pope seems to keep penning to us, beauty, but he's talking about beauty in a kind of limited way. But how would your theology frame women's contribution or women's being as beauty?
That's an excellent question. Thank you very much. I think this frame is calling for the beautiful, right? The good, the true, and the beautiful, this idea of God as the good, the true, and the beautiful. For the beautiful not to be only on the shoulders of women, but rather to have a more expansive view, which I think Benedict shared, right? An expansive view of beauty, where beauty is not limited to adornment or enhancement, but rather is a central part of revelation, but not the part that gets assigned to women, right? Not the particular assignment, like let the boys take care of the thinking and you guys can do the art, right? Because that doesn't work either, right? All the great artists end up being men. All the recognized great artists end up being men. So I think what I'm arguing for is a more sort of expansive, egalitarian, shared idea where all of us are instantiating or working toward or trying to create more beauty in the world, right? When we say that sexism hurts us all, it doesn't just hurt women by burdening us with only like being able to decorate the altar with flowers to like really minimize things. But it also handicaps men. It doesn't allow men to decorate the altar with flowers if that is their gift, right? It also inhibits, because it separates us, it inhibits men from filling out their full vocation and the fullness of God's life in them. And so I think what I'm arguing for is not that beauty has no place or that beauty should be sort of like a junior varsity sort of kind of God or kind of image of God, but rather that it, like goodness or virtue or truth, should be something that all of the people of God are called to revel in and share and contribute to the community, not just the sort of special province of one sex.
So we have time for maybe one more question before some closing announcements, and you're the closest to me.
Thank you.
I'll talk to you after. Yeah.
Hi, so I'm currently in a Catholic Faith and Life course, and we've recently discussed the church's teaching on birth control.
Ooh.
However, we highlighted a study that found about, I think it was around 90% of Catholics disagree with church's teaching. Why do you think the church has not changed its stance on birth control?
Thanks, Dan.
Sorry.
This is vodka. No. I've seen that study. I teach that study. I teach Patty Crowley's testimony to the Papal Birth Control Commission as well. Why hasn't the church changed that stance? I think that it is a case of hermeneutical injustice. And I will happily talk at length about this when I am not being recorded, but I will tell you when I am being recorded that because of its inability to consult with women, particularly women who have born children and understand the complexity of that, or doctors who help women bear children. That in locking that expertise out and that life experience out of the meaning making of what life-giving marital relation means, the church has blinded itself to the complexity of human life and human dignity in all of its forms. And I think that the people of God have spoken, right? Usually when I teach about this, I talk about the doctrine of reception, right? The ecclesiologists love the doctrine of reception, and Humanae Vitae is like our number one example, right? It wasn't received. Do I think that the church is going to put out a press release and be like, just kidding? Like, we totally take that back? That will never happen. Because the church has never done that and never will. What will happen is a new document will come in a few decades, hopefully not, hopefully less, that will say, as we've always taught, human dignity depends on self-determination, and therefore, as we've always taught, you should, limit your families in the way that you see fit, and that will be the end of it. But I don't think, the church changing its mind is simply not a thing that happens in public. It's a thing that happens sort of hidden in the next edition of the Catechism, and no one will find out unless they read it very carefully. But thank you for that question. I didn't mean to, and we could definitely talk about it more out there. Oh, wait, you have a bunch of things to talk about now, so I am going to move. Thank you.
Please join me again. You already started, but thank you, Dr. Imperatori-Lee. Before we go, we have just a few business items and exciting announcements. First, please join us after the business items and exciting announcements out in the atrium for a dessert and coffee reception. You will be pleased with the dessert, I promise you. Where you can continue this conversation and discussion with Professor Natalia Imperatori-Lee, as well as your colleagues and classmates. Second, we're delighted that our campus bookstore has Dr. Imperatori-Lee's latest book for sale, as well as Professor Christy Trena's Madeleva lecture from last year. The print edition is out, and so it's hot off the press, literally within the last 2 weeks. Those are available for you to look at and to purchase at the table out there. Third, next academic year will mark the 40th anniversary of the founding of the Center of the Study for Spirituality. It's been 40 years. We're very excited to share that we'll be hosting a series of events and programs, including a conference dedicated to the life and legacy of Sister Madeleva Wolf, which will take place this fall on October 3rd through 5th. So mark your calendars, more information to come. Additionally, we are incredibly excited to announce the launch of a new initiative beginning next year titled the Madeleva Fellowship. This program, made possible by the generous support of a donor this year, will support a selection of women doctoral candidates in the study of theology and religion to come to campus to participate in events and workshops connected with this annual Madeleva lecture. So it's exciting. Yes, please clap. More information about this program is to follow, so keep an eye out at the Center for the Study of Spirituality's website and further announcements. Last but absolutely not least, as is our tradition, it is my pleasure to announce the 2025 Madeleva Lecturer. Next year's Madeleva Lecturer, the 40th anniversary lecture, will be delivered by Dr. Kathleen Cummings, who happens to be with us this evening. Professor Cummings is Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Notre Dame. She is a renowned scholar of the history of women religious and of American Catholicism. And if you don't read American Catholic history, you may see her on such programs as CNN and MSNBC, and a great commentator on all things in the life of the Catholic Church. Dr. Cummings also served as the director of the Cushwa Center for the study of American Catholicism at the University of Notre Dame for more than a decade. Next year's Madeleva lecture will take place in this place, same bat time, same bat channel, on Thursday, April 10th, 2025. Please mark your calendars. We'll certainly be reminding you. And we're delighted. Last year, this current Madeleva lecturer, Professor Imperatori-Lee, was watching us via the live stream. We're so honored to have next year's lecturer join us in person. So feel free to congratulate her and the 2024 lecturer out in the atrium over some delicious desserts. Thank you again to everybody who came in person and joined us online. Thanks especially to Dr. Julia Fetter, to Maria Dock, and to Rebecca Holm from the Center for the Study of Spirituality for making this possible. Have a great evening, everybody.